Thank you to all of you for joining us for the third webinar of Professional Development Week from Insight Pact, hashtag Skills Amplified. This is webinar 3 on diversity, equity, and inclusion in Asia. I have with me today, who I'll introduce just a moment, Trishal Ghelani from Beti Beta. But first, just to give you a little bit of information about myself. My name is Hermes Huang. I am one of the co-founders managing partners at Insight Pact. I have been working for more than 10 years as a facilitator and trainer, working with large intergovernmental bilateral aid and nonprofit organizations across Asia and the Pacific and around the world. My background is largely in design practices, but I'm also a trained scientist, and I did my master's in Bangkok, focusing on collaborative design, working with artists in Indonesia and Nepal and Thailand, looking at various ways to design open source laboratory equipment. I'm happy to have a conversation with any of you more about that as we go. These days, we're working a lot on making sure that our partners and our clients have great experiences in the learning and development services that they'd like to have with us. Today's conversation, I do want to actually start by saying that today's conversation, I'm not an expert on this topic. I've definitely thought about it a lot. And as also an American, there's definitely a lot of, I don't even know the words to describe it. There's a lot I carry with me, let's say, because so much of the language of today's conversation in the wider sphere comes from a largely North American perspective. And so a lot of today is also really for me and my team as well, exploring with Trishal and all of you in the audience today, what this topic actually really means for those of us working and living in Asia and the Pacific. So at this moment, I'd like to take a quick chance to introduce Trishal Ghelani, who is the CEO and co-founder of Beti Beta, which is a decentralized upskilling platform working to make empowerment and diversity and equity and inclusion practices and mindsets and tools more available across Asia. She's worked with organizations and companies such as Maersk and Google, Levi's and Atlassian, and uh, is an award-winning individual in the work that she does. I fumbled there. I'm sorry, Trishul. I will also throw it over to you shortly to give yourself the real
Oh,
introduction for for you. But I'm really, really excited to have you here with me today because we've already had some discussions leading up to this and have been looking for ways to work together. And I'm happy to have this conversation with people around us this time, actually. But with that fumble, I'm going to throw it over to you to expand or to refute anything that I've just said about you for our audience.
hi everyone. It's so nice to meet you. Even though we're all just in tiny boxes looking through a screen and giving you all a big, warm virtual hug. My name's Trish, Trishul. You can call me Trish. I see another Trish here as well. So immediately felt a connection to you. And I'm from Singapore. It's a really weird thing when people are like, "Can you introduce yourself?" But I guess I will try. So I'm Indian and my pronouns are she, her, and I'm raised in Singapore. So that in itself is a really interesting, like what I call masala box, where you have a lot of like different contradicting, like just aspects of your being, and you're just like, what do I do with all of these ingredients? Um, so that's kind of where my questioning of who are we and why are we here kind of started. I think early as 5 years old. It's very kind of weird when I think back at it, but I've always like kind of stumbled on that chicken soup for the soul that my mom used to have and read all these books about life and be like, why are we here? What is life? What is happiness? And I'm like, oh, where do you even start when it comes to a lot of these things? And for me, I actually started my career in marketing and advertising because I loved the way people were trying to communicate stories to get people to buy things, I guess, at the end of the day. But the human behavior part of me was like the human behavior part of it was always interesting to me. Like just the fact that we at the end of the day, no matter in what industry or no matter in what type of field you're in, we're always looking at ways to connect. So I went from marketing to innovation through my master's at Hyper Island, which a lot of kind of where I'm at is inspired by where I learned that in order to innovate doesn't require hard skills, but a lot of mindset and really understanding who you are as a person. So a lot of self-awareness tools were taught to me in this school that really changed the way I looked at the way we think about the future. And that kind of led me to a few like kind of consulting gigs where I kind of, after my mom's passing in 2019, led to the beginning of Beti Beta, kind of like a company started as a love letter to my mom, kind of very grateful for kind of the environment she has put me in. And I just kind of realized with her passing that it came with such a privilege, that I just wanted to kind of take in what the lessons that our ancestors give us and give it to other people. So Beti in Hindi means daughter. Sorry, I don't know how long I meant to talk, so I just started like blabbering and I just had coffee. So I'm like,
That's
um,
okay. Take the time that you need and want. It's we're here for it.
this is such a cozy space. Yeah, I guess through Beti Beta with my co-founder Elizabeth Nair, I think there are a lot of ways we human beings kind of look at life and what we're meant to do with this thing that we were given. And a lot of it comes from crossroads or deciding like, do I go in this direction or that direction? Or actually as simple as just stopping to question what do you want and who you are and how do you want to do things differently. And I feel like a lot of us don't know how to design those spaces. So Liz and I kind of really started a company 3 months after my mom passed away. Not sure if my therapist will agree with most of my decisions, but I kind of just went with my intuition and I was like, why not? Let's turn this into something, like, and if you can, and you have the power to, then why not kind of create avenues that can make the world a little bit better? That's what my mom always used to say. So yeah, kind of started this company, and for a long time, we started off as a think tank, being like, oh, we're gonna be a place where people think about the future and everything, and no one cared. That was our first year. Really, no one gave a shit. And we were like, we're going to talk about culture and systems and futures and how it links to innovation. And I'm using this voice, and I don't know why I'm using this voice, but I'm going to go with it. And really, no one gave a shit. I cannot emphasize enough. And in our second year, we were like, oh, what are we actually like? And I think Liz comes from a UX designer background. And for those of you who aren't familiar with that, UX design is all about designing from the user's point of view. And it's a really big transferable skill. And I've always been a strategist in nature. So I was always a thinker. And Liz would always be like, how do we take that thought and turn it and put it and like turn it in a bunch of different ways? And I think just from the way we worked, we naturally just became a workshop company. And we have never had to do sales yet. As a 3 year company, we're actually turning 3 years in 2 days, which is nuts. We've never had to do sales. Never had to even have a marketing plan or like anything. We were really lucky in those sense where we kind of stumbled into a space that a lot of people wanted, and we had no idea why. We were like, why would people pay for this? Like, I was like, it's just conversation and post-its, no? Like, what is this that people are just gravitating towards? And Liz, bless her, had to learn how to do workshops overnight. I have come from the workshop world. I was in design thinking and innovation, but Liz was just like, I guess we're learning how to design conversation now. And that's the way she looked at it, as a space to design conversation and emotion. And that just kind of became our thing. For like the last 3 years, we've literally not had to do sales or anything purely because of a word of mouth thing that has snowballed, that we just do workshops. And we used to do workshops like we've done culture design workshops for companies. And I think Liz really looked at me as my co-founder. It's a really intimate relationship that you have to learn how to design in itself, right? Like, how do you design spaces when you're trying to build a better place for other people? You got to build it with other people. And how do you have those tough conversations? Like, we've gone through a lot of trial and error that I'm happy to share more as well, because it all has to do with diversity and inclusion, is the space you make for yourself and how you bring others into it as well. And the fact that it can be fun. I think no one really talks about DEI as a space that can be fun and should be playful and should be more experimentative. Like everyone kind of tiptoes around it, terrified that they'll be canceled for even asking the wrong question, like no one's an expert. We're all human beings and we've been trying to figure it out for all these years and we're still figuring it out. So kind of just wanted to set the tone that that was my biggest learning because I stumbled into DEI too. Like I mentioned that we were a workshop company and we kind of workshop companies was a way for List and I to be like, we will say no to no project that we get from our clients. Like, we're not going to say no to anything. We're going to say yes to everything. And we're going to work with every industry, every type of company, obviously with our boundaries in place of money. You have to still, keep food on the table and kind of really make ourselves open to what companies were going through. Workshops were literally a way for it's kind of like therapy for companies, and you're really not certified to be a therapist, but you're there anyway. So you're kind of just figuring it out along the way. Like, how do you design the invisible and the intangible, and how can you tell when someone wants to say something but is too scared to create that space? Like, how do you really push and pull with these types of energies is what we learned as a facilitator. And we worked with so many different spaces, like a shipping company. Imagine like two Indian girls, like who are like 5'2", like stumbling into a shipping company's office in Copenhagen and be like, "Hey, what's up?" And it's just a bunch of like Danish old men and Indian old men, and we're like, "Let's talk about innovation, everyone." And but I guess I think our niche was really with the fact that by the end, within 30 minutes, I had these crowd of Danish and Indian old men saying words like masala and saying words like let's slay and things like that, and not to appropriate any cultures. But it was amazing just seeing that having fun and being playful and really feeling free within this entity called life is what people were looking for on how to design but didn't know how. And somehow we had stumbled into that space where we could design a space where people could like relax their shoulders a little bit and say the wrong thing and laugh immediately afterwards. Like we take ourselves really seriously, and obviously for obvious reasons, especially with everything that's going on in the world, it really feels like none of us could ever get a break. And I think what we tend to look at workshops as is really as a tool for equity, where conversation becomes a space where everyone can give their input in, everyone can put their minds together, everyone can create something together. Like workshops stopped like being something that we were kind of weirded out that our company was associated with. Like workshops began as to like I started doing workshops in India for a bunch of like 16-year-olds. And it was like 50, 16-year-olds, and they were like, "Ma'am, I am taking your workshops and I'm taking it to my dating life." And I was like, what? Like, I forgot how powerful something as simple as conversation can be. And I think really that is what workshops are, tools to design things that we forget how to connect to sometimes. But I think through those workshops, we got to be in different industries, and that's how we got into DEI. We started getting our partner in the UK started giving us content like DEI content to facilitate across APAC. So like for Google, we ran like inclusive marketing modules. So we would just get the content and facilitate it. So it was almost like as we were learning about the content, we were teaching other people. And I think that was a really interesting way to learn in itself. Yeah. Sorry, I'm talking so much. I had coffee. Do we need a safe word? Do we need a safe word like cherry or something? Or is that too like sexy? No?
I'm sorry, I didn't even catch it. What was the safe release just?
Nothing. I said a lot of weird things and I pretended like I'm not gonna repeat that now.
Okay. It's like
Kind
we
of
do not. I think that we're okay. I mean,
what
look, I have so many ways that I feel like this conversation could go in terms of my
mm,
responses, and I will take that privilege that I have being the host of this conversation. But what I want to do is actually to flip it over to the audience really quickly, just to do a chatterfall. So if you were here yesterday, we got to do a quick chatterfall. For those of you who are here for the first time, a chatterfall is a facilitation method that we love to use in the virtual space here at Insight Pact. And basically, I'll put a prompt into the chat. You'll get about 15, 30 seconds, maybe 45 if I'm feeling generous, to write down a thought or a response to this prompt. but don't press enter yet. We're going to wait for everyone to have a chance to think before they write down, and I will give you a cue to enter into the space. But the prompt, super simple. What strikes um, your attention in listening to Trishul?
Oh God, this is gonna make me want to vomit.
So take a moment, write your response into the chat, but do not press enter yet. Okay. I'll give you a cue. So we'll just be here for a moment. We'll sit in silence um, just for a moment so that everyone has a chance to think and write.
You don't have to be nice to me. Like, don't feel weird, like, or that you have to. You can be honest. I can take it.
Well, we're also not necessarily asking you to react or respond. Part of it is also just like
Wow.
what's catching your attention in what Trishul is saying.
Let me stop drinking coffee.
Okay. In three, two, one, go ahead and press enter. And so this is the chatterfall. The chats are like a big waterfall coming through in the chat. So go ahead and take a moment to scroll up and down, and you can see what are people are interested in, so that you can see a wide variety of responses coming in. So I hear things from Romano. How do you balance safety for people to ask questions, say the wrong thing, with safety for people who could be harmed by those statements? I see a reaction from Craig about wondering why people didn't give a shit about thinking about the future and looking to the far horizon. From Noel, Trishelle is really funny. Um, Ola, playful. And also by Stephanie, bringing playfulness into DEI. And what else are we seeing here? Curiosity around the facilitation dynamic and adaptations that need to be made of UK generated content on inclusive marketing and its implementation in Asia. And some comments here around your authenticity from Christina as well. So a wide variety of responses and reactions, everything from questions to reactions about your delivery and your demeanor, Trishelle, which I think has been a great way to start. One thing that I really wanted to actually also, let's say, reflect upon this reflection that you had about with your working relationship with Liz, as well, about really just starting with two people and understanding the diversity amongst two people who are trying to do something together is something that I really, hearing that really resonated with me, because with my business partner Irene, in the last 5 years, so much of our journey together as colleagues, as co-founders, as friends, and friends trying to run an organization and build an organization together was in and of itself a deep, deep practice and struggle in understanding the multitudes of experiences that we carry with us that reflect into patterns and reflect into patterns that can hurt and can also create and can bring joy and can bring sadness and and it's a it's a tough thing to do even amongst two people who already are very aligned. And so that for me was also something that I really resonated with. And then also, expanding it to the work of creating and crafting and designing conversational spaces for people to hold the heaviness of dozens of conversations where people are just trying to start to understand one another and where they come from in spaces that weren't made for that or weren't ever socialized to be done. And spaces meaning our office places and our professional spaces to do that. Um, but I want to take it forward a little bit as well. You talked and Kat's question here, curiosity around adaptations
Mm.
to Asia. Like it is, I did mention earlier, like I've lived in Asia for now about 11 years. I am Taiwanese American, but it's that American piece that I carry with me very heavily because so much of this DEI acronym uh, is is like there's there's oftentimes, it feels like, for me at least, a big sort of like elephant in the room of like how this rhetoric is oftentimes transplanted into other places without too much thought. So I want to actually go ahead and like fold in Kat's question here in the chat around adaptations of material generated in other places, but also just what have your conversations been like, the challenges and the opportunities related to specifically talking about the diversities within us and within our organizations and within the region when you run your workshops.
Wow, that was really interesting, and I'm really happy you kind of steered the conversation in that direction because I think there are many points being made there, but to me, I'm a strategist, so excuse, this is the way I think. I think in diagrams and things connecting and all of that. It always starts with DEI starts within the self, I think, especially for Beti Beta. And I think the reason why I'm saying that is like, for example, you mentioned how did Liz and I create that space and that culture of kind of co-founder relationships and as intricate and intimate as they are, is that I think the first thing we realized is that we had to understand what made us as individuals first. And this goes into kind of Kat's question later on, because I think what society fails to understand is we tend to look at DEI as this like systemic and societal structure. And a lot of people forget the self and individual journey as well, where like what we're not just roles. And I think sometimes being in this capitalistic world and society, we're just looked at like, okay, you're this, the co-founder, or you're this, the project manager, and we're just confined to labels, but actually we're all walking lived experiences, you know? And it sounds weird as to like why I'm talking about this, but I promise I'll tie it in a second, where we're all like, you know, cat is a lived experience and lived is a lived experience, and lived experiences are living, moving, breathing things as an entity. And I think what happens is that when you, for example, take it, if you don't have understanding of the diverse being that you are and what inclusive kind of behaviors you're bringing to the table, and if you don't understand how DEI kind of relates to the self, it'll be very hard for you to even communicate that to a co-founder or to a larger system in place. Like they're all interconnected. And I think what we always see in the what like I think what kind of really frustrated Liz and I in the beginning of being in the DEI space as facilitators is that so much of the delivery was completely one way and linear, when diversity, equity, and inclusion as an industry, as a field of thought, is living and breathing because it is comprised of people's lived experiences in an interconnected manner. And we're trying to zoom out at times and understand which of these connections need more equity, which of these connections need more support, or in another time, like how do we kind of really stop looking at diversity, equity, and inclusion as a siloed structure. And I think a lot of time when we get like content from the UK, you see you know, a lot of the conversations that were sparked in Asia around DEI also happened around the same time of George Floyd. And that's how the West kind of influences Asia as well, to that degree that what was happening over there was creating activist groups in Singapore, even like I've seen it firsthand as well. And I think what we see a lot is that when offices and clients over here were trying to push DI material, or even like, for example, we had to take UK generated content and like facilitate it to Asia. We were looking through the content and we're like, this is so westernized. Like they were using Harvard Business School results about race that only had to do with kind of African Americans or white Americans. And I'm like, but we're in Asia. Like, what do you mean? Like, we can't talk to Bombay about this. Like DEI looks so different because when I distill it down, and the reason I was talking about lived experience is that you have to kind of take UK generated content and throw it in Asia. Or for example, if I was doing it for people in India, I had to take that UK content, throw it into this living entity that is India, and make sense of it. And what I think the problem a lot of people don't get is that you can't just copy and paste in DEI. You have to really understand like how does this content make sense to like people in Bombay in itself. You drive 20 minutes and you're in a place with a completely different culture. People forget that Asia is so multifaceted, even between like 20 minutes away. Like, we're not just Chinese, Malay, Indian. We're not just Asia in itself, I think, was colonized for so long that it's forgotten itself that we are so powerful and we are so interconnected only if we stop thinking in silo. And I think this concept of DEI and the way it would work is that just to answer Kat's question really clearly is that we spend a lot of time, first of all, establishing ourselves as experts because our lived experience could make us experts in the Asia market. We live in Singapore, we've traveled around Southeast Asia. We knew what this land was made of and what that kind of soil was because we lived it. And I think that itself and establishing yourself as the experts is really important when it comes to localizing content because then all it means is that we can localize content as simple as looking at a potential ad and like giving feedback, being like, you cannot show this in Malaysia, for example. Like we kind of can be their box tickers and things like that. Or we kind of really take content that makes sense to the market. I think for a lot of the work we did with Google, a lot of it was analyzing ads. So we used ads that were relevant to the market. And I think that was really interesting as well. I think a problem with that is the way people look at Asia as like they used to put the India market, the Japanese market, and the Vietnamese market and the Singapore market all in the same call without understanding that those are like massive markets all together in the same call. And I think that was kind of our frustration being a DEI company, especially like Singapore is one of the lowest in terms of policies in terms of DEI, and it's so multicultural. So to even show that this was a value and a need was really a struggle, I think, in the beginning. So I think what we realized in our frustration from DEI and how it was being taught, like who really wants to sit in a 2 hour like workshop on unconscious bias? Like you're being forced to sit there and everyone knows it. You know what I mean? So Liz and I kind of were like, how can we take the principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion and turn it into an experience? Because at the end of it, people don't understand what they don't experience. So many people don't even know what inclusive spaces feel like because they would never had access to it. So many people don't even know that spaces like this can be like something they can be a part of. And I think that's the first step is making people realize that if we come together, we can really create spaces that we think the future should be made of. I don't know if I answered those 5 questions, but I looked at them as 5 questions and I took a, like one vomit at it and attempted to do something with it.
You know, Trishal, I don't think I would be the first person to say this in this room, but you say like every other phrase that you say, I'm already like, this is another hour of conversation, and I really love it.
Yeah,
And
my mom once referred to me as an acid trip, and she never took acid, so I'm not really sure whether that's a good or bad thing, but we'll see.
another 2 hour conversation, perhaps.
I know, I know, I know. We're all being
um,
in pajamas right now. That's what should be happening, and be very comfy and just be chatting. I'm sorry, just thought I would release my innermost thoughts.
it sounds like an idea, and if you're up for that, like let us know in the chat, and we can have a pajama session at some point in the future. We'd be happy to host that. Um, one thing that struck me in this in your last response though here was around how most people or many people just also don't know what it feels like to have an inclusive space. And reflecting for myself, actually, as someone who comes from a significant amount of privilege, again, in different ways, as an American, as an American passport holder, as someone who grew up in a upper middle class family who has mobility and in different ways, it still surprises me when I step into a space that I really feel comfortable in, and to recognize that there's still a lot more that could be done, and that like for someone who comes from a background like mine who still realizes that like actually there are spaces that are could still be made. Oh, well, then of course there's a lot for everyone. I'm actually referring. We have a person here in the audience too. Stephanie recently hosted a meeting in a gathering in Australia, and I think it was the first time that I had ever been in a gathering where 90% of the people present were either queer or poly or trans, and it was just, and I'd never, and as a gay man, it was really something so beautiful, and something that I had again forgotten. And for those of you who were here yesterday, this is you might start to see that this is a little bit of a thread actually, is that some are Trishul today and with Beth yesterday, both referring to concepts of play, of remembering patterns, identifying patterns, things that we may have lost or forgotten or been socialized out of over the course of our aging and our growth. And so much of what I'm hearing from what you're saying too is let's get back to it. Like let's figure out what that curiosity is to really understand the journeys that we've been on, because they are powerful, and that there were people who took these away from our parents and their grandparents and even ourselves from today, through colonization, through oppressive societies and cultures, and whether external or internal to a particular society, however you define it as well. And there's so much to unpack and to discover that power that we all hold, as well. I mean, it's I don't even know where to go from here, to be honest. Trishul, like
No,
what are you hearing? And is there
I
another
think
thing in the chat? Like what's coming up for you?
I think, well, to address a few things, I think, like I mentioned, like one thing I really want to strive across is that me and Liz weren't also the typical people to fall into DEI. I had the most politically incorrect humor. And I had to unlearn a lot of things because I grew up in the era of Friends where we used to like watch these things for TV and like not bat an eyelid, like thinking whether it was too sensitive. And we were actually told too many times if our feelings were hurt that we were being too sensitive. And Liz and I didn't stumble into the space, and nor were we ideal people in the space. We weren't certified. We just knew facilitation. That's all we knew, and we entered the space. And I think we also weren't the typical like co-founders to begin with. Like she was a UX designer, and I was a strategist, and we both like I went to business school and I had no idea how to make money, like 0%. Like even after going to business school, I was like, so how do you be rich? And the teacher just shrugged at me and was like, have fun. And I was like, great, thank you so much for what actually are we being taught, and like what are we being educated, and what will our kids be educated with? And I think the way I think and the way Liz think is the reason why it's different is because we're designers. And I think design thinkers per se, where we see a problem and we're like, wait, actually, why? It's not about whether we need a new app or whether we need more workshops or whether we need to talk about this or whether we should do a march. We should really first be asking ourselves, like, why should people care at all? Like, I think that's the thing that a lot of people miss is that people assume that people give a shit. And I think a lot with the DEI spaces and what we are finding is that, yeah, there's a shift in power where you have like DEI is being labeled with this Gen Z future of work narrative. And that's why old CEOs are like forced to care about it now because they're like, oh shit, if I don't have a DEI policy, I'll get canceled by a tweet, who I hired 2 weeks ago because her mom told me to. You know what I mean? Like this is the way people are thinking. Like, why what will make them actually care about DEI is that if they experience it. And I think that's why Liz and I took the DEI policies, and as design thinkers where we're meant to look at like problems in our VC playgrounds. You know what I mean? That's what I call design thinking. Like if you give us a problem, we see a way to play. And a lot of that has to do like with this double diamond methodology. You can share that resource on Play that I sent you to everyone. It's a really good report. I highly recommend everyone to read it. And this I really blame Liz for. She's like forced Play down my throat till it's all I see. But I think what I meant to say is that if we are curious about something, we start to care. And I think that's been us since we were kids, playground, or adults. Like where our attention goes is where our values are. Like it's really quite simple. Human beings, like where we put our time in is where we're putting our energy in. And I think what we started to realize is that if we strip away DEI from these large philosophies and Harry talking about his weird he said unconscious bias like way too many times. He's literally single-handedly like lifted this industry. Prince Harry, I don't know if you've seen him talking about unconscious bias. He's not a great resource, but it's a funny resource to learn about unconscious bias. But I think the best way to really start learning about unconscious bias is really just by to answer the question in the chat is we use this thing and it's a really easy exercise called the 5 why reflection tool, like the 5 why ladder. And all it is like, say, for example, you grew up in a household that told you, I'm just going to be very honest, please don't cancel my upbringing. They were in a different generation, but I was always told that you can never bring home, as a brown Indian Gujarati woman, I could never bring home a black home or I could never bring home a black Muslim or white person. It was called BMW in our house. And I remember just like being like, okay, like I have 3 generations like shouting this at me as I reach puberty. Like, why is this a thing? And I think just by starting with the first why, and then from that first why, whatever you get, you add another why. And we usually do 5 iterations of this until you realize that this is just stories being told across generations. Like people talk about storytelling a lot, but what they realize is that not all stories need that much attention. And I think people stop questioning where they put their attention in. And like the attention is what makes something come alive. So if we're all putting attention into the same narrative that we've been doing as generations, that's what keeps it going. And I think when I asked my grandma, why is this a thing? She just looked at me and she said, I don't know, but Arab men are quite hot. And that was my grandma. And I was like, oh my God, like, does the all it take really a why? And it sounds silly and it sounds cliche, but that's my biggest tip about starting your journey and unlearning biases. Like, start asking yourself, like, why you think like this. It's honestly not a great thing sometimes. Like I'm in a relationship now and I was in DEI. So please understand everything I look at is through the lens of like equity and bias and everything. And I got schooled the other day when I was I called fights with my partner friction and he was like, you need to think about your bias. Men have emotions too. And I was like, I was like, oh my God, it's an ongoing journey. And like, even if you're in this field, even if I'm doing workshops about it, like, I'm a human being and our brain's been conditioned by this, like, for so many years. Like, give yourself a break. Like, we're all learning and we're all going to continuously be unlearning biases. And it's not about one camp being better than the other. Like, this is not about us being woke or like going with a trend. Like DEI is not a trend. And I think that's what a lot of people forget. Like this is the future of work and this is how we are going to build new technology. So instead of learning about coding, maybe we should be start thinking about ethics. Instead of learning about like how to join the metaverse and creating new worlds, we should think about how do we even create more equitable policies so that we can give more access in this world. And I think a lot of that was our frustration that so many skills weren't being taught, like going back to what I learned in business school, like jack shit, right? Like, so I think when we spoke about where we wanted to take our company, we were like, what is the most beti beta thing we could do, which meant daughter, in Hindi. And I think in Asia, what DEI needs more of is that intergenerational language. Like in Asia, we look at diversity, equity, and inclusion. Like you have 5 generations living in the same house. Like where are the workshops talking about that? Like trying to have sexy time with your partner when your grandma's down the road. Like how are you going to do that? Like that's the localization that's missing. Like our lived experience, And I think having the West tell our stories is so different from the diaspora that exists in Asia. And I think that was really our frustration. So we decided to really work on building, and we're building it right now. So I love to tell everyone when it's live. We're building an upskilling platform because that's the language that Singapore government loves. And that's how they look at DEI. That's another little tip. Understand how your government talks about inclusion. Like Liz was really good at it. She was like upskilling mental health. She's like, we will get in, we will get people at least in the room. We can't shove our policies or ways of thinking. Like that's not DEI. DEI is creating spaces for people to dissect their own way of thinking. It's a space for people to actually like stop and question, like, who am I? What do I think? And why do I think like this? And how do I want to think? What do I want to do with who I am and how I think? And like, what do I want my legacy to be? And I think that was what we wanted to educate people with, is that a transferable skill is not communication, it's energy. It's always been. And I think DEI is an energy. You can go, like, I've had a few of my friends being like, I felt very uncomfortable in these all Indian friend groups when I went to overseas because I felt like I was from Singapore. And just because I was brown doesn't mean I was just brown. And so many people had trouble, I think, fitting in for so long because It's not a performative solution. Like it is an energy. To feel like you belong is not because of a space, it's because that you feel like you do. Does that make sense? Like, and I think looking on that energy side of field and understanding how behaviors, like even like understand energy. If you don't mind me swearing, can I swear? We started looking at DEI as really kind of not, people will know what BDE means, big dick energy. Me and my co-founder took it a step further and we're like, actually, diversity, equity, and inclusion is really about being cunty. And I think being cunty is like our version of big dick energy where it's soft power. You know what I mean? Like diversity, equity, and inclusion isn't about begging for space. You take the space the minute you enter the room. You don't even have to like say a word. You walk into that room and you've made your presence known. It's not about begging, it's not about making noise. Like being cunty is being silent. And I think that's what we're actually trying to do is with Beti Beta. And I don't even know how my brain is working today. Sorry, I'm on a few painkillers. But everything I'm saying is like very valid, I feel, to my experience at least. Um, but being cunty to us was really the feeling of like, how could I bring the feeling that I belong and I want to make other people belong no matter where I go next. And I think that's what Beti Beta focuses on. We call it transferable skills, but we're actually telling you it's kanti. Like, that's the biggest transferable skill you could bring. Like, we wanted to make sure that we could have single moms getting into the same doors, even though they didn't go to the Harvards or the Princetons, but they had the same skill set as someone who did, which is they knew how to multitask, they knew how to manage their time. Like, how could we prove that the way we see value, and that's how equity starts? What do we see as value? And different groups will see value as different things and rate them differently. And we all really have to sit down and realize to humble ourselves that we all come from different starting points, and that's okay, and that's really okay. And I think when we get creative with it is when, how can I take your starting point? How can your starting point help my starting point? How can, like, you know, bringing in people from the audience, how could Romano's starting point help like Rosanna's starting point? Like, how could we all kind of work together and realize that we're a fluid living experience together? Like, we're all connected puzzles that are constantly moving, and it's a trip. Yeah, I understand why my mom said I talk like an acid trip now. It's weird. Okay, I think I should shut
Did you
up now.
just have did you
Yeah,
just have that realization in this space right now about the
honestly,
acid
I was
trip
like,
label?
yeah,
Well, I'm glad that this conversation could help you come to that realization in this
um,
moment.
yeah, yeah. I'm gonna keep quiet now. Should we ask everyone ask questions?
Let me look. We've got about 15 minutes left. I'm gonna make a quick interjection so that Trishal can have more coffee. We also used. Trishal talked about what was it? Five whys? Is that what you said? At Inside Pack, we actually use a liberating structure called nine whys. So we actually
Ah,
double, almost double the
are we
amount of whys
competitive
that we're
now?
asking. But for those of you who were not at webinar one on Monday, we did talk about liberating structures. And if you're curious about taking this particular tool, and you can upgauge it or downgauge it. I mean, you could do 50 whys, I'm sure, if you had the right group. But if you want to get started with that tool that Trishel mentioned, there's a link in the chat to the liberating structures page on Nine Wise, and it gives you step by step how to set it up, how to facilitate it, and then you go from there. You make it your own. You up gauge it, down gauge it, flip it around, add it to other methods and tools as you need.
Mm.
Um,
I sent you a toolbox as well that you can pop in the chat. Um,
yeah,
and it's why I think what you just said about the nine whys, they're all, I think, like, I think we realize DEI is such a big concept that we don't know how to solve, but it's as simple as tools like this, like, five whys, nine whys, like just a communication tool. And I think these tools that we're both sharing are just easy ways to build equity within yourself and within teams as well. Okay, I'll shut up now. For reals.
you know, I it's just it's so refreshing to have a conversation with you. And every time that we have a conversation, it feels like I'm having like the best like brand new cocktail every time I'm having it. Like it's just like vibrant and fresh and just like and with a little bit of bitterness because that's a good cocktails should have just a little bit of bitterness on the side as well. But the it's just even in describing the work that you do as Kanti and the first time you told me this, I was just like I also had my mind blown because I was like because the way that you described it and then just summarized it in this word and I think about the way that we've been talking about how
Yeah.
at least I see our analogous approach. I think that in Insight Pack when we use it with our clients or talk about it internally, we often talk about like taking a stand but holding it lightly. and I and I and I remember thinking this, and I'm like, oh, this is such a boring way to describe it compared to how you've approached it. But then I also think about just you use the words that work, right, to get people in the room so that you create the space for the conversations to even happen at all.
Yeah.
Like,
I think just to quickly add in, I think a lot of people forget that equity is a 360 approach. Like I have to use the word upskilling and transferable skills in a place like Singapore because that's what will get the CEO's attention. That's what makes it accessible for the CEO here. If I use words like cunty, it's accessible for other people. But like you if you want to enter the space, you have to be able to break to not put your own ego aside and play the different roles as you see fit because equity is 360. Like in order to make certain concepts like the future accessible, everyone needs to play a part in it. So even if they think like a boomer, they still have a seat on the table. Even if they're Gen Z, they still should have a seat at the table. But we need to change our language because language is the first thing of making things accessible. And I think that's what a lot of people forget that DEI can feel very heavy because it's like, oh shit, I gotta pay attention if I like before I screw anything up. It's actually just a philosophy and a mindset that this is what the future can be. And we can take a very innovative standpoint from it. Like just in the keeping in the trend of swearing and saying very terrible things. I think a lot of what we get in Asia is very limbic energy. And that's when my co-founder and I were like, what can we do to shake shit up? Because no one's gonna, again, people only get curious about what they care about. And if it's such a limbic thing to say, like DEI workshop, like, oh, I have to go for 2 hours and talk about stereotypes, like, ew, who wants to do that, right? So I think kind of taking DEI as a concept and flipping it on its head. And that is also what Kanti is. Like Kanti to us was energy and motion. And I think everything that we studied from all of our fields, like whether Liz was a UX designer before, whether I was in a different field before, it always comes down to technology can always change, but human behavior comes in cycles. And all we have to do is understand those cycles so that by the time the next wave hits, we know how to make it more accessible than the last time. Everything's interconnected. Yeah, I don't know why I said that, but I felt like I had to say
I
that.
want to take actually what you just said and connect it
Yeah,
to a curiosity that Craig here posted in the chat at the very beginning of this conversation, which is why he's wondering why people didn't give a shit about thinking about the future. But I actually want to zoom forward now because I think that you were reflecting on the early stages of what you were doing, and now what have you seen? Like when you get people to have these conversations about who they are in relation to others, recognizing the organism, the organicness
yeah,
of our systems that we're in, do people drop the veneer of like,
yeah.
oh my God, I have to be here and start to say, wow, we have a lot of possible futures that we could all be in together.
I think that's why the power of understanding behavior and the ego, two things, that's one of them, understanding behavior and ego. And the second is understanding kind of understand I'll do the first one first before I get carried away. But see people it's not that people didn't give a shit about thinking about the future. There are two reasons why they usually didn't is they didn't have the privilege to. That's number one. To even think about the future and to be self-aware as an individual and a human is a privilege. Like you have time to break down your mind. You know what I mean? That in itself is such a privilege that like, or at least the way we see value today, it's considered a privilege, but we should be valuing the mind and the self a lot higher than we do today. But so many people being in survival mode is that the future, they don't even think about the future. An example, right? In Singapore, you see a lot of foreign domestic workers who are literally just treated like slaves over here, where they come in and every bit of money they get over here, it goes back to the family, that by the end their 2-year contract ends. They go back in the same cycle, that if you study the cycle of a foreign domestic worker here, it's exactly like a refugees in Syria. Like there was actually a paper that came out. So I think seeing that like a lot of people to even think about the future means that they have to stop fighting fires in their present. And I think that's what I mean by a privilege. And the second reason they didn't care about the future is that they didn't even perceive, people only care what's in their immediate reality, or people only care what's in their reality, right? I think for a long time, yet a lot of NGOs like struggle to be like, how can I make people care about what's happening over here in my part of the world when they're watching this on an ad on a couch where they're safe? And I think a lot of people struggle with like that actual question of how do you get people to care? And I think the way you kind of get people to start thinking about the future, and that brings to my second thing, the power of a medium. Workshops are a way to get people to get their hands dirty. And the reason why we're calling our platform the playground is because that's what it is. Like it's a live learning environment. You can come in and be like, yo, what if we made like castles that had like vertical forests and we could just like eat our breakfast while we brush our teeth in the morning? That idea made zero sense. I know as I said it, I was like thinking on the spot, but like how do you get people to start being curious again? And I think that's our first step. And by being curious, they start to care and realize that they have a part to play in their future. I think really looking at those two human approaches, I love alliteration. So the first thing is people don't get curious of what they don't care about. So you have curious care, and the third C is cultivate. I think really getting people to cultivate their own emotion, that wherever they go, like the reason we focus so much on identity capital and social capital in the way we look at transferable skills is because like you need to kind of really like the only way you make change scalable is by everyone kind of bringing their own energy, and that energy connects to another one, and creating change systemically really comes from an interconnected way and form of releasing that information. So I think that's really interesting to us. I think really looking at decentralizing education is a really interesting concept that goes on, and I can talk about it for very long, that I am rambling at this point. Ah,
Well, we're coming to the end of
ah,
our hour together,
I am
actually, and
sweating. My God.
it is Singapore.
Yeah.
It is where we live. It is also part of how we move through the world. The climate, the weather, uh, I'm not even going to open that. There's a whole nother hour for that too. Um, we had a lot of questions come in right in the beginning, and they've guided our conversation through to this point. I actually do want to give everyone one more chance here to do one more Chatterfall so that we can actually source some questions, because
Yeah.
we're starting our conversation here. It feels like just the beginning with the people here in this room. So I want to make sure that let's do another Chatterfall.
Yeah, and if I
Like,
can't answer it today, stalk me on LinkedIn. I'm giving you consent, and give me your question and I can answer it there too.
so take a look in the chat. Here's your prompt. What's a question you have from this conversation? Um, and go ahead and take 15 to 30 seconds to just write down a question. I'd love for everyone in the room to write down a question that they have. There's no question too small or too large. We have to start somewhere. So please do that. We'll save the chat so that we make sure that we can start to ponder those, and that you'll be able to see what other people in the room are pondering as well. Okay, in three, two, one, go ahead and press enter.
Ooh.
So go ahead and take a look. I'm going to read them out loud for the recording here. What brought you here to this moment? Culture eats strategy for breakfast. How do we make the step from DEI as strategy to DEI as culture? a plus one for how do you balance safety for people to ask questions and say the wrong thing with safety for those who could be harmed by those statements. What about diversifying DEI from being about work to being about how we approach all our development interventions to how we see society needing to change? How can facilitators orient themselves to their audience to ask questions that can resonate? How do you dissect cultural biases in Asia versus the West in a way that makes sense to this audience? And how do you go back to basics when talking about DEI as a concept to people who are, oh, Zoom is blocking my,
Mhm.
or are not familiar with these other big concepts around UI, UX systems, human-centered design, etc. Whew, I
You
feel the
choose
weight
one. Don't
of the
make me
questions.
choose. Don't make me choose.
We're actually running out of time. So what I'm actually going to do is that I'm going to ask this group to hold these questions together and give us some space to also dig into them a little bit more. But we'll go ahead and save these questions for later because we are coming up to this last bit of time here. And I do need to wrap up with some thank yous, which is really, again, thank you very much to my team for getting this set up here at Insight Pact and for Juan on technical support as well. Thank you to all of you for making the time out of your day to listen and engage with this conversation. And of course, thank you to Trishal for being here and for having these conversations with me leading up to this hour that we've had, and hopefully to many more. And perhaps together with some of you here in this room. Um, the offer is open to everyone here. Reach out to myself, to Trishal, to continue the conversation. We're here to talk, we're here to design workshops together, and we're really excited for you to reach out about those conversations. Tomorrow, we'll be having our fourth and final webinar in this series, focusing on futures assisted design. And that's going to be actually integrating a lot of the things that we've talked about today, that we've talked about yesterday, and on Monday as well, into one really cool topic that is really focusing on the practicalities of both thinking about the big future, but also making the opportunities and to design things today. And so much of what we've talked about today with Trishel is totally applicable to that as well, because it's about those conversations that help us create the design and the futures that we want together. So with that, thank you very much to
Can I
everyone.
say something? Thank you
Of
again,
course.
everyone. Sorry that if I was on Panadol and a bit loopy and went in rambles, but it was very fun going down the rabbit hole with you, and that's what the fun is. Please find me on LinkedIn. Liz and I are going to be doing B2C workshops very soon. So if you're ever interested in learning how to do a workshop or just coming to have fun with us, just reach out to me. Yeah, that's all. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day.